So like to welcome everyone. This is one of Washingtonians for Public Banking's virtual town halls. We do these bi-monthly where we tackle an issue about banking reform, or an area that we think that is being underinvested in the state of Washington. And the question of underinvestment is really why we invited our speaker today, James Conca. We often hear that Washington is a leader in climate change because we've had some pretty bold targets that we've introduced to wean fossil fuels on our grid. However, despite the celebrations from our state, there are some dissonant voices who really are raising some red flags about the underinvestment we have in clean energy. And probably the leader of that pack of dissonant voices who are been warning policymakers in their state that we're not meeting the type of investments we have to really transition is Dr. Conca. Dr. Conca is a trustee of the Herbert M. Parker Foundation at Washington State University in the Tri-Cities. He has been an advisor of the DOA, EPA, state and federal regulatory agencies, and is currently an advisor of the Washington State Legislature's bipartisan nuclear energy caucus. Without further ado, I bring you Dr. James Conca.
Thank you. This is great. Let me quickly go over to the screen and then share it so I can get onto it. Let's see. Can anyone see that? Good. Well,
we cannot see it.
Oh, good.
I'm going to ask people, I'm going to mute people just while the presentation is going on. We will open up for question and answers later on.
Good. So I'm going to kind of give an overview, kind of the state of energy in the world, and then drill down to Washington State to see what we need to be. I love these NASA nighttime shots, not just because I used to work for NASA, but it shows you right away who has energy and who doesn't. Okay, that's what the fighting's been about. It's always been about what it always will be about. Right now, this is from the generation of 27 trillion kilowatt hours that humanity produces every year. But we are going to be going up to at least 40 trillion kilowatt hours a year. So when people talk by mid-century, so when people talk about decarbonization and things like that, they forget that the actual pie is growing, because they only think about the percentage, and we want to be 50% this and 20% this, but the actual numbers are growing dramatically. So if we look at the distribution of in energy production in the world, it splits into two parts. One is power, which we'll focus on, and then the other, transportation. Right now, they're not very linked, but they really need to be linked, okay? Because right now, transportation is completely dominated by petroleum. And if we're going to use other energy sources for transportation, like electricity or hydrogen, you're going to have to change the power distribution as well. Now, in the world, power generation is 2/3 fossil fuel, and the other third split almost equally between hydro and nuclear. It's been that way for 40 years. It's going to be that way for another 40 unless we make some drastic changes. Now, in the United States, we're still about 2/3 fossil fuel, which is kind of amazing. So we've switched from being mostly coal to mostly gas over the last 30 years. With 20% nuclear and hydroelectric, about 7%. Wind is coming up. Solar's coming up, and the others are too, but we are still dominated by fossil fuel. Now, it depends on where you live, of course. So Washington State is the least fossil fuel of any state. That's because we have so much hydro. West Virginia is the most coal, and Illinois is the most nuclear. So President Obama knew nuclear well. He liked it, but he wasn't really allowed to talk about it. European Union, a little bit more nuclear because of France, a little less hydro. Korea is about is almost 30% nuclear, and they vowed to be about 60% nuclear by 2050, just like Japan did before Fukushima, although they're coming back on. Because if you're Korea or Japan or a few other countries, you have no natural resources to speak of. You have no fossil fuel. You have no wind or solar resources to speak of, and your biomass is so little you can't even feed yourself. So if you want to not be dependent on other countries like Russia, China, and the United States for your energy source, then you go nuclear. Now, China doesn't look like much, 5% nuclear, but they are building a new nuclear power plant, a big one, every month, a new one. So by 2035, as their last 5-year plan spelled out, and they tend to stick to their 5-year plans, they will have 185 nukes by 2035, big ones, as well as a slew of small ones and everything else. But that's rather amazing, and that will dwarf. It's double us, and we are the most. We have the most nuclear power in the world, but that will double us. So, but they're also, of course, producing more coal and more gas and more hydro continue, and they're producing more renewable than anyone in the world. It's because they have such a need for energy. So they understand they just need everything. So this is the world power consumption growth curve. It's rather steep, has nothing to do with the United States. We're flat. We have been for the last 2 decades. The world is presently, like I said, at 27 trillion kilowatt hours a year. And the big question is it going to keep going up and up? Is it going to turn over at some point? So we'll talk about 40 trillion kilowatt hours as a good place to arrive at. But if you get up to that number, you're going to need 20 trillion kilowatt hours of non-fossil fuel just to keep fossil fuel where it is, not to roll it back. Now, 20 trillion kilowatt hours is more than fossil fuel produces today. So not only do you have to come up with something to replace fossil fuel, all the fossil fuel produced today, but you have to come up with twice that in order to meet the growth curve. So this is where the numbers matter. Percentages, people talk about percentages, but you need to talk about production. You need to know about what is actually produced, not a percent of what is produced or percent of what could be produced or those kind of things. You actually need the numbers, and the numbers matter. So the reason that curve is so steep is because of these people. Over 1 billion people still have no access to electricity. 2.4 billion people still burn wood and manure as the main source of energy, and 3 billion more people are going to come on board by 2050. That's a lot of people. And you might say, well, forget it. We have ours, we care about the climate. We don't, but that's kind of nasty because it turns out it takes about 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year to lift someone up out of poverty. So if you want to eradicate global poverty, which who can argue with that, and its evil stepchildren, war and terrorism, you have to come up with about 40 trillion kilowatt hours. So this is called the Human Development Index. I encourage you to Google it, United Nations Human Development Index. Basically, it shows, and this has been known for a while, that the equation of happiness is dominated by access to energy. Doesn't matter whether you were a 17th century nobleman making 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year off the backs of 10 slaves, 10 servants, 4 oxen and 4 horses. It's a great calculation for the student. Or everyone listening here, who's getting about 10,000 kilowatt hours off the backs of mainly hydro with a little bit of other. So it doesn't matter. You need about 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year to have what we call a good life. Now, let me explain the numbers here. The Human Development Index goes from 0 to 1, where 1 is absolute happiness and 0 is absolute hell. So if you look at the way the countries of the world, this is per capita use of energy, most of the world is below 0.8 and half of it's below 0.6. And what that means is that these people spend down here, especially in Niger and Ethiopia, they spend about 6 hours a day getting water. Now that is a lot of effort and time of your life just getting water. If you had a pump and some PVC pipe, you would free up 6 hours a day. And that's what energy does. It does for you what you don't really want to be doing because it's not very productive. It's simply just surviving. So if you have enough energy, you suddenly have time to go to do education, you become prosperous, you can do more. So, and it's kind of funny that this curve is rather tight. And when we talk about energy conservation in this country, we talk about moving these people down. The United States, Taiwan, getting us down per energy use, because we don't need to be 12,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. That's rather wasteful. The UK is about 6. I put California in there as its own country. It's actually pretty good too, but it's rather warm for half of that state. So, Canada is big and cold. It'll never come down very far. Japan used to be 16,000 kilowatt hours per person per year in 1990, and they have come screaming down to less than 10, basically as a result of technological advances. So this can be done. Now, these people they have nothing to conserve. All right. So the strategies here are two different strategies. And if you don't have two different strategies, you're going to fail. And that's why we keep failing. So we need to move everyone from here up to there and everyone from up here down to there to a reasonable region. Now, the funny thing is that Iran, Russia, and China are off this curve mainly because of the types of government. Okay, not that, democracies are wonderful and perfect and all that, but you tend to redistribute energy better than you do under an authoritarian government. Now, the funny thing about China is there are two parts to China. There's 800 million middle-class Chinese. That's rather incredible. But there's still 600 Chinese in abject poverty. And if you look at all of their policies, whether it's economic, military, political, doesn't matter. It's to get these 600 up into the middle class. So by mid-century, China will have over 1 billion middle-class Chinese. And what's interesting is that your economic and military power derive directly from the absolute number of middle class in your society, not the percentage, the absolute number. And that's why the United States dominated the 20th century, because we had more middle class than anyone else in the world. For most of the century, it was more than everyone in the world combined. So, but we only have 300 million. So if anyone has any questions of who's going to dominate the second half of this century, it's China. Now, the thing about authoritarian governments is they can make really stupid decisions. Not that we can't, but it could derail that. But if they stay on course, they will dominate both economic and militarily in the second half of this century, and they'll dominate energy-wise as well. Now, there is a sweet spot. If you can get everyone down to about 4 to 6,000, get everyone up to about 4 to 6,000, this is as sustainable and ethical as you can get. And how much energy is that going to require? Well, there's us in the industrialized world cut us down to 6,000 kicking and screaming, but there's only 1 billion people in that subgroup. Same thing with people at 3,000, keep them there. The developing world and those coming on board, that's where we have the huge requirement for energy, because you're talking about over 8 billion people that you have to get up to 3,000 kilowatt hours per year. And that is a lot. So it'll take at least 34 trillion kilowatt hours, and that's only if it's evenly equitably distributed, which never happens. So we're talking about over 40 to actually get anywhere near close to eradicating global poverty. So what are the fastest growing energy sources in the world? If we were in a room, I'd call for hands and people shout out. And what do you think? Everyone can shout out, actually. What do you think the fastest growing energy sources in the world are?
I want to invite people. You can also put it in the chat if you want to, if you don't want to shout out.
Oh dear, I can't. Where's the chat? Okay. Well, I'll save the the suspense here. Okay. So it's petroleum, it's oil. That's the fastest growing energy source in the world. And the next is coal, and the next is natural gas. Now, renewables are coming up, but they're so low that it'll take a very long time to reach anywhere near what those are, because the fossil fuels are still growing. See, this is it. It's like this is not stagnant. They're still growing because of all those other people in the world that need it. So if you're going to get rid of these three, you have to bring up these three. We don't have the luxury of saying, oh, we don't like nuclear, we don't like wind, we don't like whatever. No, there's a time and place for everything, and you need them all because there's not that many alternatives to fossil fuel. And fossil fuels are so dominant, and they're continuing to grow. Now, this cuts off at close to 2020, but if you look at last year, gas-fired generation in the United States grew 115 terawatt hours. And solar only grew 21, and wind lost 9. So again, at this rate, solar and wind will not even catch up to natural gas, let alone petroleum or in coal. So again, we're not moving fast enough, and fossil fuels are moving very fast still. Now, in Washington State, again, we're great, wonderful. We've done some wonderful things. In fact, the biggest emitter is transportation. That's the lowest hanging fruit, and it's the biggest emitter. Now, once we close the last coal plant in the state of Washington next year, at Centralia, this will drop dramatically from 17% down to probably about 10%. But again, we don't produce much emissions anyway compared to the United States as a whole. So, and we've done very good at reducing emissions from agriculture, waste, industrial, commercial, and residential buildings. We've done really good at cutting those down. It's simply transportation that we haven't even touched. We don't have enough electric cars yet to make much of a difference. Now, the thing about Pacific Northwest is that we're facing a significant power generation shortfall. And right now, we have a 7 gigawatt shortfall, which is, we can make up by being clever and moving things around, a little shell game kind of stuff, but we are short a significant amount of energy. And 7 gigawatts is about twice the output of Grand Coulee Dam. So this is not a trivial amount of energy. And when we get to about 2030, it's going to that capacity need is going to grow to about 10 gigawatts. Now, this was recently highlighted in the last couple of years where we had warm enough summers that we were one Snake River Dam away from rolling blackouts, according to the Bonneville Power Administration. So, and for similar reasons, Texas and California have had rolling blackouts during extreme weather, both heat and cold. And that's because, I'm sorry. So let me back up a bit. So the coal-fired power plant retirements in the Pacific Northwest are going great guns. I mean, that's great. We have closed half of our coal plants, and here was the plan, and these are all closed. Again, Centralia number 2 is going to close next year, and then these others will close too. So that's 6 gigawatts that are retiring out of coal, and then another 6 gigawatts or 6,000 megawatts are scheduled in Utah in the next few years. So we're losing a ton of coal-fired power, and we're not replacing it with anything except a little bit of wind. Now, the Northwest Power Pool, which is the agglomeration of all power producers and operators, warned in 2019. Let me see. Let me get rid of this here. Okay. Warned in 2019 that we would face a 26% probability of an outage or blackouts beginning in 2025 when we close our last coal plant, along with many neighboring states, and population's increasing for the first time in 20 years, and we have large increases in electric vehicles. So what happened is that we went from less than 5% risk of outages, which is very nice. That's why we never have rolling blackouts across the whole Pacific Northwest. But it's going up to about 26%. Now, the state legislature got really mad at that and said, hey, tone it down. We don't want everyone to be, upset or anything. So they said, okay, well, we'll postpone or defer some of these coal closings, and we'll start up a couple of natural gas plants. But all that does is replace the risk of blackouts with the likelihood of failing to reach our carbon goals. So again, it's kind of tough. I mean, this is a tough balance if you don't have the right mix and you keep closing a bunch of old coal, which is, I like to close them, but you can't just throw away 10 to 12 terawatts of electricity generation without replacing it. All right, so let's go back. Why do we care about this? Well, we care about this because of CO2 and climate change and a whole bunch of other things. And of course, all of these on the right side produce a lot of CO2 per gigawatt hour of electricity produced, and all of these on the right produce very little. Now, it really doesn't matter relative, although nuclear is the least emissive, and this includes mining and enriching of uranium, mining for steel, production of photovoltaic cells, things like that. So this is the entire life cycle, and this is the newest data from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So yeah, but again, all of these are good, all of these are bad. Now they went further and looked at many types of effects in terms of human toxicity, and ionizing radiation, ozone depletion, all that kind of thing, particulate matter formation like coal plants produce a lot of. And this is the life cycle impacts on human health per megawatt hour. So the higher the number, the worse, the more effect. Okay. So you can see again, fossil fuel bad, everything else good. Okay. Now of the good, nuclear happens to be the best. So it's absolutely the lowest human health impact. And that includes everything you can think of. And the same thing with the impact on ecosystems. This is a life cycle impact. So, and again, all of these issues here, freshwater eutrophication, terrestrial ecotoxicity, acidification, everything else, again, fossil fuels bad, and everything else is pretty good, and nuclear just happens to be the best. Now, the reason we have these problems occurring in the Pacific Northwest is because electricity has to simultaneously be produced, delivered, and consumed within a minute. Okay, these have to be balanced. If you produce more than you consume, you start blowing transformers and starting fires. If you consume more than you produce, you start having rolling blackouts. So again, this has to be balanced minute to minute. And it's interesting, if you go to control rooms at the operators, you see these huge computer screens that are tracking every generator and every major consumer in a region. This is the ISO New England one. And again, when the wind stops blowing and a bunch of wind turbines stop producing electricity, someone's going to flip on a gas plant quickly within a minute. And that's why we use hydro and natural gas to load follow or firm, it's called firming, renewables, because they're the only ones you can kind of turn on and off like a light switch. Although the new small modular nuclear reactors can also turn on and off like a light switch and are great for load following renewables. But this has to happen. If you can't, if something stops producing electricity, if you have nothing to replace that with, you're going to have rolling blackouts. And that's what has happened in Texas and California in the last few years. So in the Pacific Northwest, it's all about hydro. So here is a load graph. I love these. You can go on to Bonneville Power Administration and find these for every week going back ad infinitum. So this is one from January 4th to January 10th. This is production. The gray double hump curve here is the load, or the what we are taking off of the grid as consumers. Okay, so that's the load. The blue, and again, it has this double hump. I mean, everyone wakes up in the morning, goes to work, it goes up. They take lunch break, it goes down, it goes back up, and then it goes back down in the evening. And this is repeated every single day. Now, Saturday and Sunday, they're a little bit lower than weekdays, but it's pretty much the same. And as you can see here in the Pacific Northwest, hydro, which is this light blue line, mimics that completely. I mean, it's what we do. So when the load goes really down, we dump hydro. When the load goes up, we increase hydro. Now, if you look down here, fossil fuel and biomass, which are whoops, they don't vary much because they're constant. They're what do you call it? They're baseline. Okay, baseline generators. So you can depend on them to just produce as much as they can produce. Same thing with nuclear. Our one nuclear plant, Energy Northwest, just produces the same amount of power all the time. It has to refuel once every 2 years, and so it shuts down for a month, but that's it. Now here's wind. Wind is the dark blue line. So here on the 4th of January, it was producing a significant amount, and then it just dropped off for 2 days. And you notice hydro had to go up. And then wind comes on big time. So a big wind comes along, and for a day or so, it's producing a fair amount of energy. And then hydro has to drop. It actually has to drop below the load, which means it's negative pricing. And so basically you have to just give it away. And so, but you basically dump water over the top of the dam instead of running it through the turbine. So you lose that. And then the wind stops and hydro goes up, and then the wind came up again and hydro came down. So again, hydro is just responding to both the load and renewables, and everything else is just putting out what they can. So what this means is if you start losing hydro, you're going to have problems load following. right? So if you close dams or you stop, curtail production from dams, you're going to have some problems. And as the demand goes up, whether you're building data centers, which are huge, which take 200 megawatts each, or other manufacturing facilities or Bitcoin facilities take huge amounts of energy, then you don't have enough in reserve. So here is another one, the same kind of thing. Wind is green, hydro is dark blue, and the load is red. So here, no wind, and then suddenly, boom, wind comes up, and hydro has to drop below. You just have to dump it. So capacity factor, what this gets around, I mean, what is really caused of this, something called the capacity factor. So the capacity factor is the annual average percent of the maximum output possible. So if you have 1,000 megawatt nuclear reactor, you're going to get 935 megawatts out of that 1,000 megawatt reactor on average. These are national averages. Okay. So nuclear is just, it runs all the time. Again, it just has to stop every couple of years to refuel for a month. Now, natural gas, also very good, but it only produces, about 60% of the time. And you might ask, well, why? And two reasons. One, it's actually more expensive than you think to run a natural gas plant. And two, sometimes the source of the pipelines cannot deliver enough natural gas to the plants to run them. Coal, it's only about 50% of the time because you have to refuel. You have to bring in coal every day, about 10,000 tons of coal per day per coal plant. That's a huge amount. And then hydropower is not very high. It's only 40% of the time it's producing what it should produce. That's because we use the water for so many different things. We use it for transportation, we use it for irrigation, we use it for flood control, all sorts of things, not just producing power. And then wind is about 35%, because that's just when the wind blows. That's it. It just blows about 35% of the time. And solar, the same thing. The correct incident solar radiation occurs only about 25% of the time. Now, it depends on where you live. In Washington State, this capacity factor for wind is only 27%. I mean, it's really lousy. In Tornado Alley, in the Midwest of the United States, it produces 45%. That's pretty good. So if you're going to build wind turbines, where do you think you're going to build them, or you should build them? Not in Washington State, but in Tornado Alley. And there are a lot being built in Tornado Alley. That's no problem there. So again, the capacity factor equals the annual average percent of the amount output possible. So to find out how much power is produced from a generator, whether it's a nuclear plant or a coal plant or a wind farm or a solar array, this is all you do. You take the installed capacity, you take 1,000 megawatt wind farm, which is huge, 1,000 megawatt wind farm times capacity factor, say in Washington State, 27%, times 8,766 hours a year. That's the amount of power produced. That's it. No more, maybe less if there's mechanical issues, but no more than that. So if you compare nuclear to wind, so you build a 1,000 megawatt nuclear power plant, like I have kind of near me in Energy Northwest, or you build 1,000 megawatt wind farm in the same place, the nuclear power plant is going to produce about 8 million megawatt hours per year, and the wind farm, the same size, is only going to produce about little over 2 million. So when you start comparing costs and investment and things like that, you have to compare 4 wind farms, 4,000 megawatts of wind compared to 1,000 megawatts of nuclear to see because the output is so different. And it's worse than that because the lifetime of a nuclear power plant is 80 years, not 40. That was a number picked out of the air by the Atomic Energy Commission in 1957. But pretty much they all last about 80 years. And they're going to. Most of ours will last 80 years. So over its lifetime, it's going to produce 655 million megawatt hours, and the same size wind farm is going to produce 59. So if you are going to compare costs and output, you need to compare one nuclear power plant to 10 wind farms of the same size. If you don't do that, then you're not comparing apples to apples. It's incredibly important to do that. And no one does that, of course. So capacity factor, and then there's something called the effective capability. That means what can you rely on? So Washington State has 7,100 megawatts of wind, and the effective capability is only 7%. It's not even 27%, like the capacity factor. It says when you need it, when it's really hot or really cold, that you actually need that energy, there's only a 7% chance that you can get it from wind. So you can only guarantee about 500 megawatts of that 7,100 megawatts of wind to be there when you need it. That is incredibly important and is the real problem here, because we're only building wind that you cannot depend on when you need it, and we're shutting down coal, not just in Washington State, but in the surrounding states as well. So you're not replacing very reliable base load with completely unreliable renewables. That's it. I mean, that's the problem. No one ever talks about it, and it's really going to be a big problem. So it really depends on where you build things. So here's Tornado Alley. This is a wind um, resource map in the United States. So yeah, so here's all the big winds. Why would you build wind farms over here in Seattle? They just don't produce anything. Okay. So, and don't build wind farms in Georgia. Okay. You build wind farms here, and then you use high voltage transmission lines to get it to where you need it. That's how you do it. Same thing with solar. You don't build solar in Maine. You don't build solar in Seattle. Now, over here where I am, it's okay, but you want to build solar in the Southwest. I mean, that's where you get all of the energy from. And hydro is kind of interesting. These are dams in the United States that don't produce electricity, but could if you just powered them up. So you could double hydro in this country without building a single new dam. And that's important, because where the dam already exists, for whatever reason, irrigation, flood control, transportation, you could just power it. And the people living around it are already used to a dam being there, so that's not going to be a real problem. The environmental impact statement's already been done for those areas. So this is the lowest hanging fruit. You could actually double hydro in America without building a single new dam. Now, it matters where you put power plants because of the materials it takes to build them. Now, this is the mass of steel in million metric tons and the mass of concrete in million metric tons to build a megawatt of each of these sources. So if you look at wind, boy, it takes an awful lot of steel and an awful lot of concrete to build a megawatt of wind. And about half that for solar. Hydro is a lot of concrete, but not much steel. Coal is about a quarter of wind. And then nuclear and hydro, nuclear and natural gas, it takes almost nothing. One, because nuclear produces so much power, so per ton of steel or concrete, you produce a lot of energy, a lot more than anything else. And natural gas, because it just doesn't take anything. I mean, you can throw up a natural gas plant with almost no steel and concrete. And that's why everyone loves natural gas. We have a lot of natural gas. It's relatively cheap, and you could build one in a year. So that's why everyone loves natural gas. Now, there's a recent report out of Australia that shows the rate limiting step for achieving a decarbonized economy is copper. We talk about lithium, we talk about all this other stuff, but it's copper. We don't have enough copper. I don't see where we ever will have enough copper. It's going to take about 4.2 billion tons of copper alone by 2050 to achieve what we consider a reasonably decarbonized world. Throughout all of human history, we've only mined about 700 million tons. And just business as usual, if we don't decarbonize, we're still going to need another 700 million tons over the next 20 years. We've mined out most of the high-grade ores, and now we're using the lower-grade ores, which take a lot more energy and a lot more destruction, basically, to get those out. And, of course, the same limits apply to other metals, but carbon is the problem. I'm sorry, copper is the problem. So hydro makes Pacific Northwest energy rich, but wind makes Pacific Northwest capacity poor. And this is where grid scale storage is desperately needed. Now, grid scale storage, I mean, people talk about battery, but batteries are expensive. Oops, they're not very good. And they require huge amounts of critical metals, like we are just talking about. And those same metals are really needed for electric vehicles if we're going to reduce anything in terms of petroleum in the transportation sector. You're going to need all of these metals for that, let alone for energy storage. But actually, the best and cheapest systems for storing energy is something called pumped hydro or pumped anything. I mean, it's gravitational systems, so gravitational potential energy. So you use wind and solar. Well, let me just give an example. So here's a pumped hydro system. You have a lower reservoir and an upper reservoir of water. You have a generator midstream, and during times when the wind farms and the solar arrays are producing energy, you use that energy to pump water up to the upper reservoir. You increase the gravitational potential energy. And then when you need it, when the wind stops blowing or the sun stops shining, you let it out and it runs through a hydro generator, just like a hydro dam, and you get 90% of that energy back. It's as efficient as lithium batteries and an awful lot cheaper. So here's one that's been working in Germany since 1958. The maintenance on them is very easy as well. And it just takes water up again from the lower part to the upper part. This is just a single wind turbine that's producing some local energy. But right now, this is 119 megawatt system that is storing energy from 132 megawatts of wind turbines in the region. So this is very, very successful. And pumped hydro is 98% of the energy storage in the world is pumped hydro, not batteries. So if we want to make the 7,100 megawatts of wind in the Pacific Northwest useful, we need to build several pumped hydro systems along the Columbia. And that's easy, not very difficult. The problem is no one wants it in their backyard, just like anything else. Now, if you talk to the leading climate scientists, whether it's Jim Hansen, Kerry Emanuel on down, they all say there's no credible path to climate stabilization that does not include a lot of nuclear. And then that's mimicked in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from the UN. No one who knows these systems disagree that we can do this without nuclear energy. I mean, there's a bunch of people out there that hate nuclear, and those are more political and historic issues and have to do with ignorance more than anything else. But anyone who knows these systems, so you can't do this without nuclear, just can't. So, in fact, the new small modular reactors, you've heard of these small modular reactors, you can hook up several of them together. They're actually as good as natural gas and hydro at load following or buffering renewables. They can't melt down. We haven't been idle in the last 30 years. Okay, these small reactors cannot melt down. We know what to do with the waste. We're just not allowed to do it. And the other scary things have been fixed too. So these are even safer than the present ones, which are safer than anything else. Now, there are 3 designs that are scheduled for Washington State in the next 10 years. One is TerraPower, Bill Gates's company, the Natrium reactor. The first one's going to be built in Wyoming, but he wants to build one here. This is what that looks like. And then X-Energy's modular, the pebble bed reactor, which is an amazing design. The fuel is these little ping pong ball sized pebbles that can't melt down. And they were going to build it up here in Richland, where I am, but then it got moved to the Gulf Coast to power Dow Chemicals manufacturing facilities. So we'll probably get the second one. And then NuScale out of Oregon State, to me is the best one. It's just pretty much a small scale, scaled down version of a large reactor. But again, can't melt down. The surface area to volume ratio is such that when you shrink the core this much, you can't build up heat enough to melt it down. So this is what Bill Gates's looks like. I don't want to get too much into it. Also, these new ones have the reactor core actually underground, which is, I don't know why we didn't do that before. It's actually a brilliant idea. This is the pebble bed of X energy. The pebbles are the fuel made out of materials that cannot melt down. Then here's NuScale's reactor. The site boundary, it's about 60 acres, and that's it. That's the safety zone, not the 50-mile diameter that present reactors have as their safety zone. So how do we achieve a low carbon future in Washington State? Well, this is what it would look like, something like this. All you have to do is build one decent sized SMR bunch, a reactor set of 12 modules, and you could double nuclear in this state. Hydro is going to go down. We may lose we may lose the Snake River dams, which I think would be terrible from an energy standpoint and from a climate standpoint, but that's a whole nother issue. It'll go down anyway because the total amount of energy generated is going to be going up, and hydro can't go up. It can go down a little bit. We can triple the amount of renewables, but only if we have a decent amount of grid scale storage. So in 2022, we generated 92 terawatt hours. We have almost no grid scale storage, and we have only about 100,000 electric vehicles. Now, if we want to be like we say we want to be, low carbon by 2035 or decarbonize completely, we're going to be at least 115 terawatt hours compared to 92. If we have about 15 pumped hydro systems or grid scale storage of about this size, and we have over 2.5 million EVs that themselves are going to need about 7 terawatt hours to charge each year, then we can do this. Now, that's a lot of EVs. The problem is if you don't build a lot of EVs, you can't replace the internal combustion engines and you won't make a dent in petroleum. So right now, there's about 5 million internal combustion engines in the state of Washington, and by 2035, most likely there'll be about 8. And so we got to get way over 1 million EVs in order to make a dent in petroleum. I'm getting to the end of my time here. So in America, this low carbon plan is going to be something like this. It doesn't have to be exact, but something like this. 500,000 new megawatts of wind, 200 in the right place, 200,000 megawatts of new nuclear, 300,000 megawatts of new solar in the right place, and 120,000 new megawatts of hydro. Don't even have to build a single new dam. This is going to cost about $9 trillion, of which $4 trillion is capital. Now, it sounds like a lot, but over the same period, business as usual will cost about, hey, $9 trillion with only 1.7 trillion capital. The real cost of decarbonizing is in structural material. It's not in energy. I mean, the cost is about the same. The problem is for the decarbonized mix, you have to come up with 4 trillion in capital up front. Okay, so people don't like that. If you say, oh, we're going to spend 4 trillion up front so that later on you'll save money. No one believes that, of course, but that's the only way to do it. Well, let me back up a little bit here. For Washington State to achieve this mix is going to cost about $200 billion, of which $100 billion is capital investment. Now, that sounds like a lot, but again, over this time period, that's not much. It's just that you have to come up with the $100 billion in capital first. And that may be where Washingtonians for Public Banking comes into play. And of course, the world is even more absurd. So, 4 million new megawatts of wind, all of this, and it'll cost about $68 trillion, of which 28 trillion is capital. And who's going to pay for this? Well, it's either, the EU, America, and China. We're the only ones that have any money. So unless we fork this over, it's not going to happen. All right. I've kind of gone through the time. I'm going to keep going.
Yes, if you could wrap up a little bit so we could still have time for questions and answers. Or about that time.
Good, good.
Yeah.
All right, let's see. Okay, so how much is it going to cost? And keep in mind that are the costs amongst the different energy sources sufficiently different to justify unethical decisions? I mean, I know this is America, we're going to make a buck, that I get that. But do you have to make so many bucks that you're actually being unethical about things? Is there enough of a difference in the cost to justify this? Because if it was only about cost, we'd be a natural gas nation, no question. We have enough natural gas for the next 500 years. We're not peaking anytime soon. All right. So, but obviously, cost is not the only thing we care about. So it turns out energy has never been cheaper in the history of the world than it is now. Now, this is an interesting study by King at UT Austin, but this is, again, over the last, almost 1,000 years. In before the Industrial Revolution, which is right here where it takes a real tank, the cost, pretty much it was food. Food was your fuel. Okay, it was muscular, oxen, whatever you can get, but it was pretty much fuel, a little bit of wind, in the Dutch and sailing and things like that, but that's pretty much it. Then it just dropped precipitously, and then there's a little bit upswing before the 73 oil embargo, and then back down. So right now it is cheapest in the world in history. And so if you're going to make these major changes, now is actually a good time to make them because it's not going to remain cheap. Now, this is based on the Northwest Integrated Resources Plan. This is what, and it's something called LCOE, Levelized Cost of Energy. This is what state legislatures look at when they're trying to make decisions on energy. And I hate LCOE because it does not capture all the costs. It just captures most of the direct costs. But as you can see, I mean, yeah, nuclear is more expensive than gas and wind and solar, but it's not that much more expensive. Coal really is more expensive now, and new hydro really is more expensive. But, these four are within 1 penny of each other. So is a penny per kilowatt hour too much to spend to save the world? I mean, is it really? So again, gas is the cheapest, no question. But if cost were the only issue, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. Now, what interesting is that all these LCOE are based on Lazard analysis. I don't know if you know Lazard LCOE, but everyone looks to them to give these numbers. And again, they're really iffy on how they come up with these numbers. But you can see, nuclear is high, and some of the PVs is high, rooftop solar. But then, the other renewables are fairly low, and gas is quite low. But these only reflect direct costs, like constructing the thing, mining, and direct costs. The indirect costs are never captured. But they just finally, last year, came out with a levelized cost of firming. So when I mentioned, something has to turn on when the wind stops blowing, that's called firming, so load following. And what you can see here, make a long story short, the black numbers are the direct costs, and this is wind and solar in different markets. So this is PJM and on the East Coast, MISO, CAISO in California. So it varies on where you are, of course, but the firming costs almost double, if not triple, the cost of wind and solar. All right, so those numbers are never captured in normal levelized cost estimates that are given to state legislators. So finally, they're coming up now with firming costs, and that completely changes the whole thing, and it levelizes the whole playing field. So now everything costs about the same. And if to give you an idea of what that means, here's California daily generation curve. So the generation is red, the total generation. Yellow is solar. So when solar comes in, everything else has to damp down. You have to basically throw it away. And when the sun goes down, everything has to fire up. Now, gas is this light blue, and that really does most of the heavy lifting, as well as imports, which is purple, which is funny because they don't have to report where those imports come from or where they're generated, and most of them are coal. So that's not particularly good. But gas has to ramp up when the sun goes down, and it has to ramp down when the sun comes up. So what happens is that you have a dozen or so what are called peaker plants gas plants that you can turn on and off like a light switch, and they generally idle all the time until the sun goes down, and then they boom, they come on. All right. And so they only work for several hours a day and they idle the rest of the time. Now, who pays for idling a gas plant? They're not cheap. You basically have to pay them not to produce energy. So we're back to the old stuff with the farmers. And again, the average capacity factor of one of these peaker plants is only 2.6%. So it's only producing 2% of the energy it could produce if it were running all the time. And it could run all the time. It just is used to back up solar. So that's why those indirect costs were so high. Oh, sorry. So if you look at indirect costs as well as direct costs, and then you factor that all in, as IH Market did a few years ago, then the cheapest electricity is existing hydro. Existing hydro is the absolute cheapest energy source there is. So the idea of closing down hydro dams should be thought really, really carefully because it's the cheapest energy we have. Existing nuclear is 4.5 cents. The second most cost effective is you don't shut down nuclear power plants if they're perfectly good and safe and they've been, having their license renewed for the next 20 years, which we keep doing in America. We have shut down a huge number of very good nuclear plants. I mean, there's only 2 that actually should have been shut down. And the other 14 are just wonderful. Why did you shut them down? It was purely politics. So now new gas is 5.9% per kilowatt hour, or if you think we'll ever get to net zero, which is dubious, then it's going to go up to 7 cents. New nuclear is 6.9 cents, and new wind and new solar is 8.9 and 9.8. These are the most expensive things, and that includes a taxpayer subsidy. And you have to remember that taxpayer subsidies don't reduce the cost. They simply shift the cost from the ratepayers to the taxpayers. And since we don't know where our tax dollars go anyway, it's kind of gets lost in the shuffle. But someone's paying for it. We are paying for it at some point. Regulation, regulation, regulation. I love regulations. I hate deregulation because all it does is allow certain companies, banks, or whatever else to just gouge and do what they want. And we saw that in Texas a couple of years ago when it got really, really cold and everything collapsed and 170 people died and it cost $3 billion in damage. And the the ratepayers were told to pay an extra $1,000 to fix that. And it's like, what? So, I like the regulations in the Pacific Northwest. They're still good. We are basically a public utility districts across the Pacific Northwest that are wonderful. All right. Any questions? I have some safety stuff here if you wanted to see. This is the mortality rate from each energy source. So
That's great. I'm just going to cut you off here just because I want to be
Yeah.
respectful of the time. So we're gonna extend that just a little bit and try to leave it open for about 10 minutes for questions. For our organization, we really appreciate the work that you do in providing a firm number on it and the type of investments that we have, because one of the purpose of our organization is to try to create that provide avenues for that capital and create inventive ways to get new capital to markets that are in dire need of it, like clean energy. But we will now leave it open for questions. If you want to ask a question, just ask if you raise the hand feature on Zoom, and then I'll call on you. And the floor is now open if anyone had any questions.
Any questions?
Yeah. If no one asks a question, I have one for you. Oh, we have one for Diane. Go ahead.
Yes, you said you know what you want to do with nuclear waste, any waste that's produced, but you said they won't let us. I'm assuming it's the legislators.
Yeah.
They won't let you do it. So tell me what you want to do with it and why they won't let you do it.
Okay.
Thank
In
you.
1957, the National Academy of Sciences chose Carlsbad, New Mexico, the deep salt deposits there as the best rock for disposing of nuclear waste from any source of any type. And it started, operating. And then the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of '82 came about, and they just forced the repository on Nevada, okay, at the nuclear test site. And it was a lousy rock. I mean, I worked on both of these for 25 years. The rock they chose was actually the worst rock you could possibly want to put this into. And they wouldn't let us put most of the waste into the salt, which is the best. It takes 1 billion years for water to move an inch in this salt. It's really, really tight. It's molecularly tight. But some of the bomb waste, like from Hanford, continued on into the salt, kind of below the radar. And it's been operating for 25 years without a hitch. I mean, it's just absolutely brilliant place to put nuclear waste. It's easy to do. It's cheap because it's the right rock. You put it in the wrong rock, it's expensive and difficult and you'll fail. Put it in the right rock, it'll work fine. So we're not allowed to put most of this waste into the salt where it's supposed to be.
So this would be Washington State waste
It
that would want to take to another state and
Well,
put
it
it
would
there?
be, yeah, it would be all nuclear waste from everywhere. Doesn't matter what state.
And so is it the state where you want to deposit this that's saying, no, we don't want your waste?
Well, yeah, mostly it's them, but it's also other states too, which really kind of drives me nuts, especially Washington State. They've actually pushed back on this. It's like, wait a second, don't you want to get this out of Washington? And again, everyone says, well, New Mexico's already taken a lot of this waste, and it's true, they have. Someone else should take it. It's like, what? You're going to think you're splitting the risk. When you split it, when you make 2 repositories, you double the risk. You don't have it. I mean, if you understand risk at all. So this is the best rock in the world to put this. We've already been doing it for 25 years. Just, it was built and designed for all nuclear waste of any type from any source. So why would you put it someplace else? There's not
So
enough.
is it that Washington State doesn't want to keep the waste? Is that what they're saying?
Yeah, Washington State doesn't want to keep it, and I understand that. We were supposed to get, again, the National Academy of Sciences said we need 1 repository because there isn't enough waste from the entire country to justify more than 1 repository. Volumetrically, it's really small, tiny. Even the waste at Hanford, 56 million gallons sounds like a lot, but it's trivial compared to any other waste stream. I mean, coal produces that much waste every 30 minutes.
And how long do you anticipate the waste would be there? Because that would, we have whoops, right? And so that's been an issue. How long is the life?
Nuclear waste from any source. The hottest is from nuclear reactors, like out here. Like the one whoops reactor that was actually built, which is another. We can go into whoops because whoops was a debacle, not because
no. Just the bottom line is, if you deposited this waste wherever, what is the life expectancy of it?
Okay, after 300 years, it's not very hot. After 300 years, you can hold it in your hand. It won't hurt you.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's 300 years, it's hot, for 300 years. So that's why you put it in this salt where it's completely encapsulated for 1 billion years and it's gone. I mean, it decays away. So the hot stuff decays away really fast. That's why it's hot, right? The stuff that's not so hot, like plutonium and uranium, you can, again, hold in your hand because it's not very hot. And it takes 1 million years to decay away because it's not very hot. So, this is kind of a funny thing. There are 2 parts to the waste, the really hot stuff and then the not so hot stuff.
Okay, I won't take any more of your time. I'll let somebody else share.
Yeah, we have time for 1 more question, maybe perhaps 1 or 2 more questions. If nobody has one, I have a question. The state, Dr. Conca, if the state does have a few programs to try to promote clean energy. We have a revolving loan fund dedicated to clean energy, a few things. How optimistic are you about those programs to really, move us forward on this issue, to really push fossil fuels off the grid?
Right. It depends on where they're investing, right? So if you're going to build more wind turbines, it's going to be a total waste. Now, if you want to make the wind turbines we have effective, like I mentioned, then you want to build pumped hydro. So if those funds go to building pumped hydro systems that store the wind energy for when it's needed instead of throwing it away, then that's good. All right. If you want to, use those funds to promote charging, charging stations around the state so that people will buy more EVs, that's great. So the big thing we have to do is produce more electric vehicles, produce more grid scale storage, like in pumped hydro, and build more nuclear.
And come up with $200 billion with
Yeah,
$100 billion in credit,
right.
with the capital to do it.
It's gonna be tough.
Yeah. Okay, so we are at time. We're a few minutes over, but I want to thank Dr. James Conca for the excellent presentation. These are recorded and they will be on our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it again, or if you have anyone else in it, you can review it there. And I just thank everyone for being part of coming to Washingtonians for Public Banking's event. If you haven't already, I know I see a lot of the names look familiar, but sign up for our newsletter. You'll get a weekly update. We have a weekly segment where we talk about a banking issue, and then we advertise our bi-monthly virtual town halls for the future.
Great. Thank
All
you
right.
so much.
Thank
And
you.
again, get me back to talk about nuclear waste if you want to delve into that in any real depth.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So
Thanks.
thank you all for attending.
Let me stop sharing here. Oh, good.